Hello, everybody. My name is Noah Stern, and I am a second-year Masters of Community Planning student at the University of Cincinnati.
And I'm Serena Powell, a fourth-year Bachelor's of Urban Planning student at UC.
And today we will be discussing in depth a very interesting topic, that is Cincinnati housing history. This is a part of a larger podcast project that seeks to explain how housing policy and history laid the groundwork for the surge of institutional investing in single-family homes in Cincinnati. This is not a Cincinnati-only issue, though, is it, Serena?
The majority, if not all, U.S. cities have presented a stage for real estate investors to buy up land and property and then sell and or rent it to others to make a profit. Cincinnati is no exception. In fact, Cincinnati's ties to investors are as old as the city itself.
The real estate market has been a for-profit market since the town of Cincinnati was built. A bunch of investors from New Jersey bought thousands of acres north of the Ohio River between the Little Miami and the Great Miami River up into Butler and Warren County for peanuts from the federal government, and then subdivided it and sold it off, some of it to individual homeowners, some of it to other investors who then subdivided it some more. The Cincinnati was built by real estate investors seeking to make a lot of money, and they did.
That was Cincinnati historian Doctor Fritz Casey-Leininger describing what was the Sims Purchase, which is how Cincinnati came to be. It turns out, before Cincinnati was even an established city, the decisions and actions of real estate investors were already influencing it. The city that came to be Cincinnati was built in the basin between hills, and according to Dan Horn's article in the Cincinnati Enquirer, quote, in the 1850s, most of the city's 115,000 residents were packed into a 6 square mile area along the riverfront, end quote. As a result of its geography, until the turn of the century, Cincinnati was considered a walkable city.
With the advancement of public transit, which was first only accessible to the wealthiest Cincinnatians, the city began to change. The advent of streetcars and the inclines started to open up new areas to middle and eventually working-class Cincinnatians, who no longer needed to be within walking distance of their jobs. However, this increased accessibility wasn't available to everyone.
Avondale, Walnut Hills, Clifton, then College Hill, Price Hill, Kennedy Heights, all of whom were either served by electric streetcars or railroads, maintained themselves as largely upper middle class and elite. The wealthy suburbs made sure that, as much as possible, that they kept out African Americans, except for a small number of servants.
Initially, the wealthy, and then the middle and working classes, viewed the property they acquired through this migration out of the urban core as an investment. We interviewed Greg Hand, a long-term resident of Cincinnati's West Side, observed that his perception of land as a person's most valuable asset has persisted throughout Cincinnati and the country's history. In reference to his own grandparents, he explained.
They didn't trust banks. So land was where you put your savings. Today, you would go to the bank and you'd deposit money, and then you'd go to the bank and you'd withdraw money. Well, back then, you would buy land, and then if you needed money, you would sell land. So my ancestors show up quite a bit buying land, selling land, that sort of thing. And so ownership was really important because to them, that was wealth. Land was wealth.
These communities of homeowners building wealth through their property lacked the racial diversity that was characteristic of the urban core when Cincinnati was that walkable city in the 1850s. In fact, Cincinnati's real estate board institutionalized discrimination. Up until the 1920s, the board mandated, according to Horn, quote, no agent shall rent or sell property to colored people in an established white section or neighborhood. This inhibition shall be particularly applicable to the hilltops and suburban community, end quote. While racial diversity was not a characteristic of the inner ring suburbs, socioeconomic diversity was.
If you look back in the 19 teens, 1920s, you'll find things like, basically my great grandfather was a carpenter, and he lived across the street from a doctor, and a guy down the street sold cars, and a guy on the other side was a gardener, and you just find this economic diversity that you really don't see today.
While the composition of the inner ring suburbs reflected a level of socioeconomic diversity once reflected in the urban core, by the start of the 1940s, the urban core itself had become increasingly less diverse, its residents overwhelmingly low income and Black.
By 1940, much of the West End was very much majority Black, and the West End had become the primary residence for African Americans in the city.
The concentration of Black Cincinnatians was primarily in Walnut Hills in the West End. After all, when it came to the urban core,
if you didn't have to live there, you didn't. You got out.
This resulted in housing vacancies in Black areas measuring 10 times lower than in white areas. Along with this, redlining practices reinforced by the Fair Housing Administration in the 1930s limited Black Cincinnatians' mobility regardless of their economic resources.
Cincinnati was deeply segregated. The housing market was highly discriminatory. They just couldn't get into any place else. If they had the money to buy a house, they couldn't get mortgages. Few of middle-class Blacks moved into Walnut Hills, but both the West End and Walnut Hills Black communities were bursting at the seams.
This isn't something new, though. As we are all too aware, Black people have few housing options.
And landlords jack the prices up as much, when that basic economics works. When there's high demand and low quantity of product, prices go way up.
Throughout this time, the national practices of zoning worsened the Black housing crunch. By prioritizing the separation of residential, commercial, and industrial uses, Black neighborhoods came to be viewed as less fit places to live, making the neighborhoods farther from the urban core more desirable and consequently more expensive to live in. Planners like Alfred Bettman, who was an influential Cincinnati planner, described multifamily housing as, quote, disorderly, noisy, slovenly, blighted, and slum-like, end quote. This led to the rollout of urban renewal policies. Entire neighborhoods were razed, and tens of thousands of Black residents in Cincinnati alone were displaced.
the effects can be seen in the 1950s. 16,000 Black families moved from the West End into Avondale. The Black population in Avondale increased 5 times, growing from 17 to 70% in a single decade. Whole neighborhood blocks seemed to flip from white to Black almost overnight. White residents were also on the move during the 1950s, but their motivation was not driven by the destruction of their homes. National programs and marketing, such as the 1957 short film produced by the popular Red Book magazine, advertised an idyllic and exclusionary suburban lifestyle, waiting in the newly constructed suburbs far from the urban core.
These are what Red Book means by its young adults. People in a certain living situation with particular interests and particular goals.
But it wasn't just this appeal of suburban life that inspired this massive migration of white people from the inner-ring suburbs. A new practice known as blockbusting capitalized on white homeowners' fear. Blockbusting was the scheme of real estate agents walking door to door in neighborhoods such as Avondale in the 1950s, encouraging these white homeowners to sell their houses. And a 2008 study found direct evidence of this practice in Cincinnati.
What you did have was small groups of investors buying property in Avondale and Walnut Hills from white homeowners, and often scaring them. It's like, you know, there are Black people moving in 2 blocks from you, and if you want to get your money out of your house, you better sell it right now, and I'd be happy to buy it, take it off your hands, and then you can move to one of these new suburban locations.
Once the landlord secured the housing stock, they implemented the same discriminatory practices that they had a decade earlier in the West End.
And then they would turn around and either rent to Black families, or they would sell them on what was called a land contract.
A program remarkably similar to modern rent-to-own practices, where the tenant would pay the monthly mortgage with the goal of one day owning the home. But as soon as they missed a single payment, they would usually be evicted, losing their housing and their investment as a whole. By the 1960s, it was clear that housing history was repeating itself. The Cincinnati Enquirer article, Neighborhood Integration, Tricky, from May 1968, called integration a, I quote, tender plant in many Cincinnati neighborhoods these spring days, blaming its precautious state on, quote, worried white property owners and eager real estate agents. The Enquirer speculated whether neighborhoods, quote, will stay integrated or follow the old patterns of succession, moving steadily from all white to all black. Greg Hand knows this pattern play out in his own family.
None of my siblings bought a house from a relative, but my parents' generation, a lot of them bought houses from generations before, and then that generation bought houses from the generation before. So yeah, where would I draw the line? I'd probably say before 1960 that was common. After 1960, I'm not aware of it happening in my family.
All in all, the result of all of these events and practices is that by the end of the 1960s, the black population in Walnut Hills, Avondale, and Evanston, an area of the city that historians sometimes refer to as Cincinnati's, quote, second ghetto, was 3 times greater than the black population in the West End. And by 1970, it was clear that the city's migration history was repeating itself in the entering suburbs. And as a re-emphasis, Dr. Fritz Casey-Leininger observed about the very first movement out of the basin nearly 100 years earlier.
If you didn't have to live there, you didn't. You got out.
More than what we made, and just as